I used to jokingly say to people, when you go to someone's LinkedIn profile and see how many shared connections you have, if you get above a certain number, really you should be roommates. You should share an apartment
Yeah.
together because you seem to be so closely aligned. And I think in our case, I think it's like 85, and we know a lot of the same people. I noticed that you write for Search Engine Journal. I know Lauren pretty well. So welcome to the show. It's great to have you on as a guest. I see you're from Kansas City. So what do you think? Do you think you're going to do a three-peat this time, or?
I mean, I hope so. It hasn't gotten lost on me that growing up where we thought we'd never see a Super Bowl. So between the Chiefs and the Royals World Series back in 2015 and then being back in the playoffs, I'm telling my kids who are 14 and 10, I'm like, this is not normal. You're you're living a charmed life for sports in Kansas City right now. So don't take it for granted. And hopefully it's not a 30 or 40-year span before it happens again when this window closes.
The thing I'm always curious about, I know a lot of American people. I go to Vegas a lot to go to conferences, PubCon, and places like that. The
Yep.
thing I'm always amazed is that there's some sporting event going on, like almost like 24/7. It just seems like there's always some sporting event that's kicking around in America. And for some strange reason, all my American friends, it's almost like they can't sit down to watch any sport unless they've got skin in the game, unless they've got some money on it. What is the obsession with kind of American people in gambling? Do you
I
know?
don't know. I've dabbled a couple times in it, but I'm too connected to like my teams, and I'm huge into the University of Missouri football and basketball too. So I'm very emotionally invested in it. So I try not to bet on my teams, and I play fantasy sports, and so I know too much of the unpredictability of it probably to place any bets. Digging deep into players and all the things that go wrong with that even. So I don't know. It's this crazy fascination and fixation on point spreads and everything else. When the Chiefs 2 weeks ago, toward the end of the game, punter ran out of the back of the end zone, took a safety just to as a strategic move to kill clock. Like the people were all the betting community was up in arms because that moved to the other side of the point spread.
Right.
I'm like, if you're really that invested, maybe you have a problem.
Yeah, it seems that way. Like I said, I always like to have a little bit of dialogue before we dive into talking about marketing, but primarily that's what the
Right.
audience is interested in. They're interested in learning a bit more about the guests and their digital marketing journey. Looking at yours, you've had quite a checkered journey to get to where you are now. Maybe you can just talk me through that.
Yeah, this is the 20th year of my career. Thinking back to when I graduated, I started, yeah, that was 2005, was before everything was open source. Didn't know what digital was. We didn't call it digital yet back then, and ended up in the digital spinoff of a traditional small agency here a few blocks away, and was a project manager and learned some HTML, was a buffer between designers and developers and clients. So I learned put some communication skills into practice after a couple of years of doing that. I felt like I was an order taker and wanted something else. So an opportunity to learn SEO emerged. My new manager who was brought in wasn't going to do the day to day. And I raised my hand and said, can I move over there? And so he sent me out to Bruce Clay's training in California. And I'm so thankful for that investment because that was such a deep dive into end to end all things SEO, and took it over there and did SEO, started informal leading a paid search team, ended up coming over here to Voltage in 2013 to start a digital marketing team and more of a creative agency. And now we're a fully digital agency. I went through a succession plan a few years ago, buying out one of the original co-founders. I'd worked my way up to president and then went through a plan with him. And so now it's my shop. And in the last couple of years, I put into practice some of the things I'd been hearing and learning about and researching for a while about niching down and being a specialist, because we were 20 something people trying to do everything from branding to websites to everything under the digital marketing umbrella. And we were spread really thin. And naturally, because of my passions and my experience, search was a big factor in that, and web was too. So those are the two things we do today. I started trying to figure out how to articulate our approach and the importance of having strategy ahead of just diving into paid search or SEO or any of the other channels. And so that led to me writing my book, which came out last year, forced me to get it into a 5-step process and be able to articulate it. And we're pretty disciplined now where most of the time we're starting with the process, well, even if it's the lightest version of it. If somebody's like, hey, I just want search, we're still not going to just skip ahead and do search unless the exception would be we 30 or 40% of what we do is agency to agency as well,
Right.
as we've narrowed our focus and position ourselves and been validated in it as an expert in it. Some other large full service agencies, including a global one here in our region, have brought us in as their SEO partner or paid search partner or web partner. That's been good for us as well. So we skip some steps there sometimes if they've got all the intelligence and research and things we need. But in most cases, that's our flagship where we start. I spun that off as a separate LLC intentionally. I wanted it to be able to stand on its own merit and not be looked at as just another marketing ploy by an agency to try to sell something different. So it's its own entity. Technically, the trademark and IP is in it, which I license back to the agency, to Voltage, for use as well. So I've started building the content platform for it separately and speaking and training specifically on it work well. And then if somebody wants the done for you or the guided version, that's where I'll funnel them over to the agency to implement.
Think has to sit separately. It can all coexist to an extent. I would say that some of these digital marketing infrastructures, they're almost like the Olympic rings. It's like they all intermesh with each other, but there's not necessarily a complete overlap. I see a lot of agencies do what you did. We're all things to all people, and I think sometimes when you're all trying to be all things to all people, you ultimately end up being nothing to nobody. And sometimes it's much better
Yeah.
to focus on the things that you're good at, that you enjoy, that pay well, and be known for doing that. I started to try and do a little bit of everything to begin with. Soon realized that I was probably not very good at SEO, or it just didn't really float my boat as much as paid advertising did. So I really stuck with that. When the opportunity came to diversify from just plain vanilla PPC in the traditional sense of Google and Microsoft and start doing paid social, that then threw into Meta, it threw into TikTok, Snapchat, and then I got involved with programmatic advertising, and that opened up another whole ecosystem for me. I really say, even though we're doing lots of different disciplines, they're all interrelated, because we tend to find that it's a bit like in an orchestra, you have the conductor, then you have the woodwinds. It needs to work cohesively because people's journeys tend not to happen in silos. I think that's one of the reasons why a lot of businesses fail, is they have their email marketing team that never talks to the SEO team, that never talks to the paid search team, never talks to the web development team, and they're all doing their own thing. And ultimately, businesses fail as a result of that. Whereas if you have somebody who's calling the plays, to go back to the football analogy, you have an Andy Reid that's calling the plays, and then everyone's executing the plays on that basis. I see agencies like us with the offense or the defense, like in terms of what we're trying to achieve. If we're trying to do troubleshooting because somebody's got into problems, we're there to help solve them. We're there to try and scale people in with the offense and try and drive some creative stuff.
I love the analogy.
I take my hat off to anyone that's written a book. I know so many of my SEO friends have written books, and I admire them. A lot of them, it used to be I'd go to a pub con, and people would have written books, and they're typically, quite often, the kind of SEO books that they've written were really thick. I would arrive at PubCon with my laptop bag, and somebody would go, "Hey, I'll give you a book." They'd sign it inside, give it to me. And then another person would go, "I've written a book, sign it inside, give it to me." And I'd end up with my laptop bag would be about 25 pounds. I'm like, my God.
Yep.
And now I feel like,
Yep, I can relate. Yeah, because I try to pack light with a really minimalist bag, and I'm like, now I'm carrying books under my arms.
you don't want to leave them behind, but at the same time, you don't want to force yourself on people. What was the driving force behind wanting to write a book in the first place?
Yeah, I'm a member of Agency Management Institute, so I'm in like a live peer group, but through that, Drew McClellan, who runs it, and he co-wrote a book with Stephen Westner from Predictive ROI, who also serves agencies and works with them on finding their niche. and then establishing your authority position for your content. And so they co-wrote a book and also called Sell with Authority and Lead a Workshop. And that was really good accountability for me because I've been reading about niching down everywhere and thinking about how do I then plant a flag in the ground and say, this is what I'm about. Their model is really heavily on having some piece of cornerstone content that for a year or two or three that you can leverage. And then by trickling out cobblestones from it. And the cornerstone could be a podcast. It could be a industry research that you do, a keynote speech that you're giving, or a book, or a really well done blog or piece of just meaty content, whatever it is. And for me, we started down the path of let's create. My team was excited. They're like, let's create the Wikipedia of SEO. And naturally, by just doing that, even if it's none of it's controversial, it is controversial, right? When you have any POV and you say you're defining anything for SEO, I've learned that by being on the Simpo board years ago. And how many arguments, if we ever talked about having even a neutral accreditation program, that was too much for my team to take on and for us to work through while doing client work. I love to write. As you mentioned, I write for SCJ, I write for Search Engine Land as well. I've written for Forbes. I love to write. And so I'm like, I could write a book. I could put this together. We need to articulate our framework. I'm just going to give the whole thing away. I've learned that transparency really works as well, and not sharing, not acting like there's smoke and mirrors behind it. So that's where I started.
I've always said that there are a lot of people that feel they need to keep everything hidden. And I think in some respects, the more you're able to convey your expertise in that format, the more people will feel this guy really sounds like he really does know what he's talking about. The fact he's written a book about it enforces that, because the barrier to entry for agencies is so low. It's always been comparatively low, and it's almost got even lower again. You can set up an agency now. You don't even need a website. You can fire up a Notion site. There's so many different ways in which you can do everything cheaply, and everyone's got a professional grade video camera in the form of an iPhone or Samsung phone or whatever to create content. There's so many AI tools now that can make your audio sound great. We're here with decent microphones, but even that, you don't even need that. I've been recording into my phone, uploading it to Adobe Podcasts, and they have an AI enhancement tool that cleans up your audio, and it makes it crystal clear, no matter how crappy audio was to begin with. It makes it absolutely crystal clear, to the point all these external mics I've got to stick on top of my phone and camera, I don't even need to take them anymore because it's so good. One of my clients very early on, I think they were a sort of an ISO accredited company. They produced some medical device. And the guy asked me, he said, Jim, if something happened to you, like in your business, what would happen to it? And I'm like, I don't really know. And he said, what if you'd have been run down by a bus yesterday? I said, I don't know. He goes, are all your processes written down? I'm like, no, they're all in my head. And he says, you need to get them out of your head and you need to get them onto paper. And ever since then, everything that we've done has always had a written down sort of process for it in terms of what it is, right? Sometimes it'll be in a written format. Sometimes it'll be video, instruction videos. Again, I've always maintained that if you have a process and it's written down, then if you train somebody on how to do that process and they don't get it the first time, fine, great. You can show them again how to do it. If they don't get it again, then you have to question their ability to be able to absorb that information. But sometimes the process needs to be updated because things change. What we think may have applied before. It's almost like painting a bridge. Once you get to the beginning, you'll just start, go back to the beginning, start again. That's always the thing I've maintained with writing a book. It's very dangerous when it's a kind of factual book because so much of information will change. If people pick it up and read it, they could start calling you out saying, this is wrong and everything else. So how did you address that when it comes to making sure it stood the test of time without having to kind of go through so many rewrites?
Well, and that's why people who are looking for give me the magical three tactics to do today will be disappointed by this book. And I point that out quickly. I'm like, this book is a 5-step framework to make sure you don't get anything out of order and don't mess up or overlook something. But it's really the end result is about your own work in it, going from strategy to the tactics to the application to the review and transformation steps. And so it's almost a choose your own adventure book in a sense, but it helps you organize work that is just chaos, or you skip steps, or you just do a bunch of tactics or a checklist. And then you're like, well, where's the ROI? So That's thankfully, that makes it a little bit more timeless, and even more relevant while we're as distracted as we've ever been with all the change happening right now anyway.
There are a lot of SEO agencies, they've realized the opportunities for them exist in specializing in a particular vertical. So they might do SEO for home service companies or SEO for lawyers. Does your agency specialize in a particular vertical, or are you more agnostic?
We're more agnostic. We do have some clusters of clients in different industries where we've trended a little bit toward B2B, thought leadership driven, lead generation, long sales cycle, quality versus quantity. That's been a good spot for us, but we have some of our biggest clients are e-commerce or a solar company in Southern California selling to homeowners. So I say, I look at a pocket of a sweet spot being in that more B2B professional services, but at the same time, I don't want to discount where we do really good work in some of those other areas too.
I'm quite curious. My agency has been around since 2012. So what's that? 13 years now. But I've been in the industry for 26 years. My most recent agency, I set it up, and very early on, I put it into the HubSpot ecosystem for everything. So the website's hosted on HubSpot's ecosystem, and I really bought in and drank the Kool-Aid for the whole inbound marketing methodology and everything else. In light of what's happened with HubSpot recently, with the most recent kind of Google update, HubSpot getting absolutely crucified and battered, should other companies that maybe run their ecosystem on the HubSpot platform be concerned at all?
I'm not the way I look at it, my interpretation is it feels like it's more about the content and HubSpot's own content versus the platform itself. I haven't seen anything that has, and I know it's still emerging, and there were more articles even just yesterday following up on it, but I hadn't seen any even headlines of things I haven't read yet about any issues with the technical side of their infrastructure versus it being more of an isolated content issue or authority status issue with HubSpot itself. But it's interesting to think about as we've had clients on a range of platforms, but as a shop that does the other half of our work is web based. We're a WordPress shop, and even for e-commerce, we love WooCommerce because it seamlessly integrates compared to some of the other platforms that may excel in the shopping cart functionality, but are harder to get optimized when it comes to robust content on top of that. So,
Yeah, people go and go, I've got a Shopify site. Great. But Shopify is not particularly good for blogging. So it's like, okay, so we need a WordPress site.
right,
And then there's
right.
Shopify is not really good for emails. And all of a sudden you need Klaviyo or something like that. So everything seems to be like an upsell to try and get you to, even, again, just even sort of parity. Whereas you say like WordPress with Woo is like a good integration because it all sits within the same architecture that everything is built on. So
Yeah, that's what we've found, and we've been pretty disciplined in staying in that ecosystem. We're constantly evaluating things. Obviously, the WordPress and WP Engine drama, things like that, make you are always a good checkpoint for reevaluating what your tech stack is. We use HubSpot as our own CMS, but we have clients who are range from Dynamics, Salesforce, HubSpot, Pipedrive, and anything else you can think of, and a lot of email marketing tools and bolt-ons. We just had a second conversation yesterday with a prospect who's a global company, massive company. They've tried to streamline and be just like three different integrations and trying to reduce the number. And I always appreciate that. There's a balance of not putting all of your eggs in one basket. If
yeah.
something weird would happen or that it's hard to move them and move away from something if customer service fails or the tech fails or there's a controversy or something happens. But the fewer connected things you have and points of failure, the better, especially if you're trying to do marketing and you don't want the tech to hold you back. It seems basic, but we get wound up and tied into so many different platforms and want to bolt things on and test different things that it's hard to resist that temptation too.
Yeah, I remember going. I was at a sort of bit of a crossroads, and I went interviewing for jobs. I wasn't looking for a job. I was just curious to see what the process was. So I applied for some jobs, went for some interviews, and got talking to one of the big UK-based agencies. and I was talking to one of the leadership team, and I was trying to establish how they managed their client relationships, both in terms of who they faced with on the client side, but also what they had internally. And they had so many different tools that they use in order to manage the paid advertising, but they're all different. And you had a team of people that would look after account A with one tool, and then the team that looked after account B with another tool. If people from account A went on holiday, the people from account B couldn't look after anything because they didn't know how the tool worked. And they had 6 tools. There was this, you can get up to speed much quicker if everyone is working and using the same sort of crib sheet to deliver what they need to deliver. Whether it's the right tool or the most cost-effective tool doesn't really matter. It's more about the efficiency rather than the cost. I've always maintained, if you have 10 people that have to use it, that's going to cost you a lot more than the tool ever will, right?
Exactly. And to your point earlier, you talk about your experience with documenting processes. That's tribal knowledge in those teams' heads and or in just how they operate. And so that's not easy to replicate. And if that happens on the brand side, that's dangerous too. And what I talk about, if you don't have a documented digital marketing plan, it's personal to the person doing it, so it's hard to challenge or make objective, or it's not accountable to the results over long term. But in many cases, somebody leaves. We look at the shortening tenure of people in roles and how people move around. Somebody leaves and that plan can't outlive the person's tenure there. Then you're starting from scratch and the next person's coming in and now you're changing your stack or your process or your focuses. And it's just wasted money, and wait time is in many cases more valuable than the money.
Yeah. And I think, again, I think that's where tools like AI can really come into play. I'm starting to really embrace using AI internally for some of the kind of the management of our documentation. We have a whole bunch of documentation. I'm doing podcast episodes and YouTube videos and all sorts of stuff that's kind of all over the place. But what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to store everything in Google Drive, get it transcribed. So I've got all the transcripts. I can then interrogate the transcripts with AI in Notion and actually just write a summary of what's happened. So every time we have a client meeting now, we'll use Google Meet. It'll record it. We'll do the note taking. We'll do the video recording. It'll get stored in the cloud. We know what was agreed on the call. I don't have to have somebody there scribing who was in attendance, what was discussed, what the points were, what the action points were. AI does that for me. That's
Yeah.
freed up a lot of time, made the process slicker. And then obviously from that, we can actually ask questions of the data. We use the system, our data, in which to inform opinions. So I can say, show me all the podcast episodes where we talked about a particular topic. It'll just give me a list of all of them, however many there are and wherever they are. I don't need to worry about that anymore. It's been
Yeah.
quite interesting to do that. So
I love that. And yeah, and I know we use Google Workspace as well. And so in Google Meet, yeah, I just saw that they just added by default some new Gemini tools. And so they're
I
getting
thought
much
they were
better.
crafty. They were
And
trying to charge you money to begin with and then realize probably
yeah,
people weren't going to pay for it and like, I will just give it to you. I'm sure it'll jack up
um,
the per seat price in due course, but
it it did. Yes, I just got that notification right around the same time. That's going up, and it's just defaulted in there. And you're talking about systems. A great book that our agency is using and a framework is called Systemology, and it's really the system for documenting systems. It's one of the key takeaways from it is to make sure just when you do the thing. So what you just said, document it. The temptation is there for us anytime we start documenting that we want to go iterate on it. And that's the danger is that we start iterating on it or we don't want to document it until we feel like it's perfect and it never gets documented. It's it's something we'll do the next day or tomorrow or it becomes a bigger task. Just get it documented, create the framework in the library, and then you have the right and it's much easier to come back and iterate on it
yeah.
and you don't have the risk of it staying in someone's head for a year, they never do it, and then they leave.
I'm using tools like Cast Magic. I don't know if you've heard of Cast Magic. You can upload a video or import a YouTube video, and it will pull the information down. It'll give you a transcript. It'll give you titles, YouTube descriptions, keywords, give you suggestions for a pod guest, thank you notification, to what to include in that, questions to put into Facebook group. There's so much information you can put into it. But that's obviously one purpose that you can use it for that. But equally, you could do it. You could have it with every meeting that you have. You could literally do exactly the same thing. Have the transcript, have it sent out as a kind of a document, have it summarized, and you can just ask the questions if you wanted to create a blog post. A guest I had the other day about Dean Jackson, and Dean Jackson, one of the greatest marketers I know, and he came up with this concept of one of his team does a 90-minute interview, and on the basis of that interview, they can then write a book for you based on that interview. Right? So you're basically talking like we are now. So we talk for like 90 minutes. There's probably enough words in our conversation to formulate a fairly decent sized book.
Yeah.
A lot of it might be complete crap, but who cares? That's by the by. But there'll be some points that we can put in there and go, that was discussed, that was discussed, that was discussed. I would say when I get to the transcript and it gives me the timestamps, I can always look at the timestamps to know how good a podcast episode was based on how many of those there were and what it actually says in terms of what was discussed. Because I think that's where those are the sort of jumping off points. Because if somebody, let's say you get to 40 minutes, 45 minutes, a lot of people won't necessarily listen to a 45-minute podcast episode. There might be 3 bits in it that they find of value. And I'd much rather they can cherry pick the ones that they feel are relevant to them rather than having to go through the whole thing right from the beginning to get to the point where they can get the information that they want.
That's how I operate.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I love that. I mean, my wife and I, she's a scientist, and she and I both a couple weeks ago, just it was a Friday night from 7 to midnight, and sitting in front of the TV, both on our laptops, just playing around, testing, doing more testing in Chat GPT and seeing what we can do, and just nerding out together. I'm excited about some of the things that just 2 years ago, I was considering looking at a VA to go do some of these tasks and to help me be an extension of myself for things I didn't have time to do or felt very manual. And now I kind of laugh because I can have that feedback in real time, and I don't even have to have another person, and I don't have to give them the full context. And so it's amazing what just the past several months I've been able to figure out in my day to day to get through some things I hate or not have to do the things manually that I hate to do.
I still enjoy going out and walking. I find it very cathartic to get out, get some fresh air and blow the cobwebs off. And I would go out and sometimes I'd listen to music, sometimes I'd listen to, but one of the things I've added to that queue now of things that I can actually do, there's a service called 11 Labs. I can upload a blog post. So like you've just published a blog post like right now that's gone up, I think, on LinkedIn. So I could grab that, copy the URL, and it would basically read it to me while I'm walking. So I don't even need to read it, right? Because I've fallen over a few times recently where I've been on my phone looking at stuff and tripped over the kind of sidewalk. And I'm thinking, well, this is like obviously a bit clumsy of me. Whereas if I've got headphones in, I can consume the content. So you've written it as a blog post, great, or a LinkedIn post or whatever it might be, but I can consume it in a way that suits the thing I'm trying to do at that point. So I can probably consume maybe 8 to 10 blog posts while I'm walking for an hour. Whereas if I was trying to read them, it would take me probably 45 minutes. I may end up being distracted by ads. SEJ's got loads of ads on it and everything. I find sometimes, shiny objects. I'll go, sometimes that's where I end up. And I think having the ability to be able to just get into the zone and focus on the words.
I love that.
It can make a huge difference.
That's the solution for having 100 tabs open of the things you're going to come back to later, right? And that you never come back to because you're working.
Yeah, I use a system called My Mind. So I can grab images and text and everything and put it in there. And rather than it just being you have to force it in. Like I used to use Evernote a lot until I got disillusioned with it because it was just, I clipped so many things that I never ever went back to. Whereas with My Mind, again, it just puts it all in one place. I can look at it however I want, but I can also, again, export it to Notion. There's so many different things that you can do to grab information. I've also said you'll read an interesting snippet. So you can just grab that snippet, send it straight to Notion, send it straight to My Mind. That then becomes something that potentially is something you can use like Notion AI to interrogate what you have. So you can say, go into the ideas and find me 3 ideas about this. And you can do so much with that.
I love it.
So
the nerd in me loves it.
So one of the things that again, I was kind of keen to talk to you about is you've done a lot of speaking. I'm looking at your lanyards behind you. You clearly have attended a lot of conferences. Unlike me, I used to save the lanyards, and then it got to the point, I'm like, this is crazy. I've got way too many of these. So I end up now I think I normally throw them out in the hotel before I even leave the hotel. What sort of things do you look for when it comes to attending a conference? Do you exhibit? Do you speak? Do you just go as an attendee? Are you there to learn?
There are definitely seasons for things. So I attend an agency focused one called Build a Better Agency Summit in Denver in May each year. And that's where I really work on filling my tank and being around peers. I've spoken at SMX and Search Engine or at Digital Summit and other regionals in the past. And that's awesome too, being with and attended for everything from PubCon to SMX and those as well. So both sides of it there, and just nerd to nerd, filling my tank there, and just being with my people essentially. My focus is more streamlined now on getting, even if it's an audience of one, into a room or onto a show, or where I can openly share, like we talked about earlier, the concepts of the start planning process in digital marketing success plan. That's really helped me stay focused on and not have all these 100 different random topics, whether they're helpful or not, and be experimenting, but to stay focused on what I feel like saves brands money, helps them not waste time and not be frustrated with agencies, of being able to understand from the start how to work through a framework and not just go do a checklist or whatnot. So that's really the subject matter for me this year, and probably even into 2026 as well, because it isn't about the timeliness of where we are in all the things with AI. It's more, it adapts and is adaptable and customizable to that, but it's really about not getting burned, not taking shortcuts, and having a strategy that's documented, accountable, but also adaptable. So that's really my focus, because again, that's where I start so many conversations naturally anyway. And I kept the content close to home. I didn't make it a crystal ball forward 10-year where we're going to be book, but really my whole thing was, where can I best help people, versus trying to be the breaking news expert, or the cutting edge person out there. And so it's got plenty of that and room for that. And I have to stay close enough to the cutting edge, but at the same time, there's so many companies, especially those that are tied down more in regulated industries or have a lot of compliance connected to them, that just need an advocate, or just need someone to tell them where to start or how to bring things forward, and don't necessarily need to be on the bleeding edge of where AI is
So,
at the moment.
if I was going to go to Amazon and look for your book, obviously there'd be a link to that in the show notes after we come off the
Yeah.
call. Who would be the kind of the best people to go and read it? I know you're going to say everyone, but is there a specific group of people that you would say it's more beneficial for them to read it rather than others?
Yeah, I would definitely say marketing leaders in organizations. I've spoken to startup groups and small businesses, because it's a framework if you've not started anywhere, even if you haven't been burned or wasted money yet, to prevent it. But in many cases, medium to larger size businesses. So whether it's a CMO or a C-suite person, or a marketing director, marketing manager, it's really, unless you feel like you've got digital marketing dialed in and or have a really well documented plan, it can serve as your framework to do your entire plan start to finish. Or if you've given up on certain marketing channels, and you're scared to you put your toe back into the water, it's a great resource for that. Or if you've got, even with a robust plan, and you just want outside perspective to think, where or do we have gaps in our current strategic planning process? It'll be great too if there's one thing of the 5 steps, one step where you feel like you're light on what you're doing, to give you some perspective to amplify your process as well.
You're a 20-year vet. I'm a 20 plus year vet. I still learn every day about digital marketing something, right? There's always something that I'm like, wow, I didn't know that before. I think there's the bottom end of a slope that's pretty steep, and nobody really knows what's at the summit of it with the whole AI thing and how that's going to impact everything that's going on. with all the sort of generative AI and agentic AI and everything else. And it's so exciting, but so scary in some respects. I'm nervously excited about the next 3 to 5 years in terms of what's in store for us all, really.
Yeah, no, I share that sentiment. I'm really excited about the cool things we can do today and where it's going. I also see an opportunity um, with more diversified traffic sources and having to double down on expertise in whether it's SEO or paid search or whatever of where it's going. Like a lot of changes over time, people who don't adapt will get left behind, and you will be able to recognize the old tactics that we still see some people doing.
Yeah.
And just like anything changes, there'll be new people jumping in thinking this is an industry to disrupt and I'm going to AI my way through it. But what gives me confidence is that leveraging my time in the industry and seeing how many, the constant of change and how many things have changed, the human problem solver and thinking about how to connect this all to business outcomes and not just be a set of tactics in marketing channels, that value will remain. And whether I'm advising clients or hanging out with agency colleagues, we're all leveraging that experience, maybe in new ways, but being able to be at the controls and being able to navigate that and coach and consult through that, it will be the key. And so, yeah, it's interesting, watching, the zero click and the trends with Google sending less traffic, those weren't just an AI driven thing. I remember sitting at SEM PDX in Portland in 2019, and Rand Fishkin was presenting data back then of the trend line was already going that way.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
being able to adapt to the more diversified search sources and not just settling into what the best practices are with Google or everything being reliant on what Google's whims are.
Yeah.
Now there's the need to change and adapt, but there's also big opportunity to take it to the next level and be there and be positioned where our target audiences will be found.
Yeah, Will Reynolds gave one of the keynotes at the most recent PubCon that I attended, and he was talking about his search volume has dropped by like 40%, but his lead volume hasn't dropped at all, right? So, obviously
Yeah.
that's impacted by ChatGPT and people finding a different way to get their information. So the whole 10 blue links at the window. Interestingly enough, I watched a friend of mine, Ethan Giffen, who's the CEO of Groove, based out of Baltimore, and he posted a video the other day where he was basically saying that he was talking to somebody, and basically they had gone to ChatGPT and they typed in a query that basically said, "What sort of things do I need to do to find a good agency, and who would you recommend?" And his agency came up as one of the agencies that ChatGPT recommended, and obviously that's throwing a whole different complexion in terms of how people potentially can use GPT to find you, right? So it's almost like you've gone from being in the Google index to being a recommended source by being omnipresent, being helpful and adding value.
Yeah, I actually was just thinking about this the other day. It's totally different models, but I thought about how 10 years ago, 2015, landed a client who found a recommendation for my agency on Reddit. And he's like, "How did you do that? How did you influence that?" I'm like, "I didn't, right? Because the Reddit ecosystem and community is much more protective in policing commercial content and things like that." And it feels like as we're going through that, I mean, it's totally different, but in my mind, similar to some of those scenarios of how do we get in there? And right now there's some best practices emerging, and there's a lot of research from, you mentioned Will and Mike King and others, and Rand has a ton daily that seems like are coming out as the picture emerges. Um, it's being adaptable. I was talking with a friend yesterday about the need to not just say, okay, for 2025, this is where our audiences are and where our tactics are going to be, but you got to revisit that and be constantly watching. And
All the time.
I just saw a Martech article about Google, introducing a new media mix measurement model. And then, a lot of even more confusion with the new updated version of Chrome coming out on whether we're going cookieless or not, or if it's still very murky.
Yeah.
Like there's just so much out there in upheaval. And you mentioned my article, LinkedIn article that went live this morning featuring my search engine land article from last week. It's like we gotta not get distracted by the things that work, from the things that work today, by what's to come. But at the same time, we can't bury our head in the sand and ignore it. So there's got to be that level of balance. I joked about, or talked about, you know, testing, sitting, in front of the TV on a Friday night. That was fun for me. But for some people, it's not fun and it's overwhelming. Or some of us can waste half of our day testing and take our eye off the ball. And so it's about getting that finding balance, personally and as organizations too, to make sure that we've got intentional, defined testing time set aside. So whether we're wired to be testing all the time, to put it in a box. And if we're not, and it's the thing that gets pushed out to the end of the day or the end of the week and never happens, making it intentional and putting it front and center. And so that's, I think, probably one of the biggest challenges for everyone, because even friends who own software companies and are on the cutting edge of some of the AI things that they're developing, even some of them feel like they're behind. And I think we all feel like we're behind, and we could fall into this weird imposter syndrome as well when we see other people doing cool things.
Yeah.
And it's just dangerous to fall too far on one end of the spectrum.
Yeah. So, Corey, it's been fantastic to have you on today to talk to me on digital marketing stories. I've actually got to go and pick up my grandkids from school, so I got sort of delegated with
Nice.
dad duties. Fantastic, right? So, yeah. Otherwise, I'd like to say, well, we can just carry on talking, but I'd love to have
Yeah.
you on, come talk to me again to see if some of the predictions you made for 2025 materialize. You mentioned about moving into 2026. Love to have you on and come talk again. And obviously, if we get the opportunity to meet in person again, I'd love to buy a drink and just catch up. That'd be fantastic.
I would love it. I will nerd out with you anytime, Jim.
And obviously, all the links to your book and everything else will be in the show notes, as I mentioned. Make sure you follow the podcast, and we'll see you on the next episode of Digital Marketing Stories. Take care. Bye for now.